The woman my son married once looked me in the eye and called me family. But her idea of family was locking me in a freezer so she could steal $99 million of my life's work. She thought she'd silenced me forever. But when she came home, I was waiting. Before we dive into this story, make sure you're subscribed and have notifications turned on so you never miss a tale of justice. And I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from today? Let me know in the comments. Okay, let's get into it. It still makes me shiver when I think about it, not from the cold, but from the memory of betrayal that cuts deeper than any ice ever could. You never expect that danger will come from within your own family, from someone who smiles across your dinner table and calls you mom. That evening, I found myself trapped inside my own walk-in freezer, of all places, staring at shelves of frozen food and feeling the icy air wrap around me like a coffin. My heart pounded not just from the chill, but from the realization that this was no accident. My daughter-in-law, the woman my son had chosen, had deliberately pushed me inside and locked the door. Her motive? Money. $99 million. To be exact, the fortune I had spent my lifetime building brick by brick. Money I had set aside not just for my son, but for future generations, charities, and causes that mattered to me. To her, it was just a treasure chest she believed she was owed. In that frozen silence, I could hear my own thoughts louder than ever. How had it come to this? How had family, the people you're supposed to trust above all else, turned into a threat to my very life? I pressed my hand against the metal door, feeling the bitter cold sink into my skin, and I promised myself one thing. If I made it out alive, she would regret underestimating me, because betrayal has a way of sharpening a person. And as much as the ice bit into my body, the fire of my resolve burned hotter. Before I take you deeper into that night, you need to understand who we all were before the mask slipped, before greed and betrayal turned family into enemies. I'm a woman in my early 60s now, but I wasn't always the person you see before you. I was raised with very little, and every dollar I made was a dollar I fought for. Over decades, I built businesses, made smart investments, and eventually sold one of my companies for a staggering sum. That $99 million wasn't just a number in a bank account. It was the story of my life's sacrifices, nights spent working while others slept, risks I took when everyone told me to quit. It wasn't handed to me, it was earned, and I carried a quiet pride in knowing that one day it would secure my son's future, along with doing good for the world. My son, my only child, was the reason I pushed through so many of those grueling years. He was the one person I thought would always understand the value of integrity, because I raised him on those principles. But as much as I loved him, I knew he could be naive. He wanted to see the good in people, sometimes to the point of blindness. And when he fell in love with her, I saw him tumble headfirst, with no guardrails. My daughter-in-law, let's call her Elena, was beautiful in that polished, magazine cover way. She had a dazzling smile, a way of making strangers feel like they'd known her for years. And yet, there was something in her eyes that unsettled me from the very beginning. A sharpness, a calculation, as if every kind gesture was part of a ledger she was keeping. At first, I brushed it off as my own protectiveness. After all, what mother is ever truly ready to hand over her son to someone else? But small cracks started to appear. Elena's compliments about my home always seemed to circle back to questions about its value. Her offers to help me manage my estate felt less like kindness and more like probing for access. She would ask casually, "Do you ever get tired of handling all that money by yourself? Don't you think it's risky?" Her words had a sweetness to them, but underneath, I could hear the hunger. My son defended her every time. Mom, she just cares. She just wants to help. And I wanted to believe him, because I wanted to see him happy. So I smiled, bit my tongue, and told myself I was being paranoid, but deep down, I knew. I knew that her smiles didn't reach her eyes. I knew that her constant curiosity about my accounts wasn't just idle chatter. She was circling me like a wolf dressed in silk, waiting for the right moment to pounce. And the worst part, I let it go. I let it all slide, because I wanted to keep the peace. I told myself love could change people. I told myself my son's judgment couldn't be that wrong. But life has a way of teaching you lessons, even when you resist them. And mine was about to come crashing in, harder than I ever imagined. It was a cold evening, though not nearly as cold as what was waiting for me. I had invited Elena over to help me organize supplies in the estate's storage area. It wasn't unusual. She often insisted she wanted to be useful, and I thought perhaps keeping her busy would ease her restlessness. Besides, my son was away on a short business trip, and I didn't want her to feel lonely. We moved between shelves, sorting jars and frozen packages that had been delivered in bulk. She was cheerful that night, almost too cheerful. Her voice had that sing-song quality people get when they're trying to hardy. At one point, she glanced toward the walk-in freezer and said, "You keep everything so well stocked. You really could survive for months in here if you had to." She laughed lightly, but her eyes didn't match the sound. I brushed it off and stepped inside to place a box on the shelf. The freezer light flickered softly above me, illuminating rows of frozen meats, vegetables, and ice cream stacked neatly in labeled containers. I was bent over adjusting the box when I heard the heavy metallic thud of the door slamming shut. For a split second, I thought it was an accident. I turned, expecting Elena to swing it open again with an apology. But then I heard the click, the unmistakable slide of the external lock snapping into place. "Elena?" I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. My breath puffed in little clouds in the freezing air. The door did its stick. There was silence. Then her voice, muffled but sharp. "You should have thought about sharing, you know. You have more than you'll ever spend in 10 lifetimes. And I'm not waiting until you're gone." Her words sliced through me more cruelly than the cold that was already gnawing at my skin. She didn't sound apologetic or conflicted. She sounded triumphant. I pounded against the steel door, the sound echoing back at me. "Elena, let me out this instant." My voice cracked, not from fear, but from disbelief. She didn't open the door. Instead, I heard the faint sound of her laughing, soft at first, then louder, and then the muffled hum of her voice as she spoke on the phone. I pressed my ear to the door and caught fragments. She was calling someone at the bank. She was asking about transferring funds. My funds. The freezer air was so sharp it felt like needles pricking my lungs. Each breath grew heavier, slower. My hands were already numb, but my mind was blazing. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't a joke gone wrong. My daughter-in-law, my son's wife, had just locked me in a freezer to die, and in that instant, a line had been crossed. There would be no going back. The cold pressed in from every side, settling into my bones like lead. My breaths came out in ragged puffs, white mist swirling in the air. I rubbed my arms furiously, trying to generate even the faintest bit of warmth. But worse than the freezing air was the voice I could hear through the insulated steel. Elena wasn't leaving. She stayed just outside, her heels clicking on the concrete floor as she paced. Her tone was casual, almost playful, as though she were chatting over coffee with a friend. But the words that filtered through the door twisted my stomach into knots. Yes, I have the documents. No, he won't be available. Yes, urgent transfer. 99 million. Yes, all accounts. She was talking to a banker, using my name, my fortune, the lifetime of sweat and sacrifice that represented everything I had ever worked for, was being parceled out by a woman who hadn't lifted a finger to earn it. And all the while, she believed I was inside that freezer, slowly freezing to death. I pressed my palm against the cold steel, straining to catch every syllable. Her voice grew sharper, impatient now. Don't worry about his signature. By the time anyone questions it, it'll be too late. Just process the paperwork. I'll handle the rest. My heart hammered in my chest. Not only was she planning to steal the money, she was confident she'd get away with it. She thought she was untouchable. Then came the worst moment. She lowered her voice, but I still caught it. He won't be a problem much longer. Let's just say, the estate will be in mourning soon. The sheer audacity made my blood boil hotter than the ice round me could ever chill. She wasn't even hiding it anymore. She was declaring her intent to murder me, to erase me as casually as one crosses an item off a grocery list. I hit the door with my fists, the sound echoing inside the metal chamber. Elena, I shouted, my voice hoarse. You'll regret this. Her laughter floated back through the crack, light, mocking, the sound of someone who believed victory was already hers. Then I heard the faint swish of her coat and the fading of her footsteps as she left, humming as though nothing at all was wrong. That moment shifted something inside me. Fear gave way to clarity. I couldn't just survive this. I had to make sure she faced the weight of what she had done. Every word she spoke, every fraudulent move she made, would have to come crashing down on her. And though she didn't know it, she had just handed me exactly what I needed. Evidence. Her arrogance had made her sloppy. She thought I was finished, but I was only getting started. The freezer was cold, but the fire of resolve burned so fiercely in me that I barely felt it anymore. She had doubled down, cementing her betrayal. Now it was only a matter of time before I struck back. The freezer's cold had a way of slowing time. Minutes stretched like the thin film of ice that would form along the edges of the shelving. At first, I tried to count simple things, the way my grandmother had taught me. 1 Mississippi. To Mississippi, anything to keep my mind from spiraling. But counting didn't fix the numbness in my fingers. It didn't warm my lungs. It only made the silence louder. Her voice had become a soundtrack to that chill. I could hear her footsteps fade down the hallway, then the muffled slam of a car door as she left the property. For a while, there was nothing but my breath and the distant hum of the freezer motor. I told myself to stay calm. I told myself the lock might be old, that someone would come by soon, that this was an awful, impulsive act that could be undone. And for a heartbeat brief, foolish, I imagined my son. I pictured him returning home, throwing open the door, seeing me with a flushed face and a shaky laugh, and everything being explained away. A misunderstanding, a prank, a terrible mistake. I wanted to believe that he would protect me, that love would be louder than greed. Then I heard the phone ring. It was distant at first, swallowed by the thick walls. But then the sound ricocheted through the metal like thunder. Her voice answered, clear and clinical. The words they exchanged burned into me with awful precision. She spoke to someone who sounded like a lawyer, then to another number that I recognized as one of the private banking hotlines I had once used. Each sentence she gave was a nail in the coffin of any hope I'd had of this being solved by accident. I'll need those documents drafted tonight, she said. Make sure the signatures look right. Don't worry, by tomorrow morning, the funds will be in my account. She paused, then added, as if delivering a final line in a rehearsed play. And don't call the estate. We don't want unnecessary attention. I felt something inside me break, and then remake itself into something hard as flint. That was the first moment I recognized that fear had become fuel. Fear will protect you, but fuel can power a machine. I had to turn whatever trembling remained into action. Time, in that cold, became a series of small torments. My knees knocked together involuntarily. My fingers were puffy and white where the blood had pulled away. I pressed my forehead to the cold metal and tried to breathe slowly, 3 in, 3 out, because panic would make the cold worse. And worse meant I might lose the chance to do anything at all. And then she called him. I don't know if she intended for me to hear it, maybe she wanted to gloat. But the way she said his name made my lungs seize in a way that had nothing to do with the temperature. David, she said, and my son's name felt like a blade. I've told Mom you're on your way back, but that won't matter. The transfer is set. By the time she's found, everything will be in place. There it was, her complete indifference to the life she'd tried to extinguish. Indifference, not remorse. Indifference, not even basic human hesitation. My son's voice answered, softer, confused. He asked where she was, what was happening. Her responses were calm, rehearsed. She slipped in the pantry, she told him. We're fine. Don't worry, everything is under control. My mind flashed with every photograph on my walls. Birthdays, first steps, graduation. I had raised him to be decent, to understand right from wrong. I had believed that decency would outlast temptation. Now he was being fed a lie to cover a theft and an attempted murder. The betrayal was layered so thinly it became almost transparent, soaked through with deceit. Then, without the pretense of secrecy, she started delegating. She instructed someone to handle certain paperwork. She told the banker to expedite transfers and the attorney to prepare affidavits. Her voice was a conductor calling out the orchestra of her plan. I could hear the names, the times, the details, a phone number here, an appointment there. She was meticulous. She was proud. Pride is what undid her. Or rather, pride in the belief that she was too clever to be caught. It's a strange thing to watch someone's hubris in action when you know it's directed at you. The feeling is not only of being wronged, it's of being seen as expendable, as a problem to remove. The realization filled me with a cold so sharp it convinced me not to act rashly. Rashness, I promised myself, could be used against me. If I survived this, I would be the one to set the terms, not her. That decision, calculated, terrifying, and absolute, was the second breaking. The first was the slap of the door. The second was the knowledge that she was already building the scaffolding to rewrite my life into her own story. I had to know exactly what she was doing. Evidence had to be gathered. If she wanted to pretend the truth away, she would not be allowed to. The freezer was an attempt at silence. I would make it a crucible. My hands found each other and squeezed, forcing life back into nerves so numb they might have been made of glass. I thought of small details. How long had she been making those calls? Had she been using our home phone once she left? Did she use her personal devices or borrowed ones? Every detail was a thread that, when pulled, might unravel her. Memories came next, of a life lived with awareness of risk. I had never been careless with money, because money, for me, was always a responsibility. That responsibility had taught me to be cautious. Years earlier, as a precaution against every conceivable betrayal, I had installed certain measures in the house, small, private precautions I'd only revealed to my lawyer and myself. I had always believed they were insurance against strangers, not family. Yet suddenly those measures felt like an inheritance I hadn't yet needed. but now could not imagine living without. In that cold, something else crept into my awareness. Small metallic clicks and soft electrical hums I had previously ignored. Security lights, cameras that watched the driveway and the pantry. The house that had been built to cradle us had also been built to observe us. I had set those things up not because I was paranoid, but because I knew how easily trust could be weaponized. If I had been less terrified, I might have laughed at this irony. Instead, it hardened my resolve. She had walked into a house with too many eyes and assumed she could act with impunity. Her arrogance was a mistake, and it was one I could exploit. I remember the exact second I decided I would not simply claw at the door until my hands failed. I pressed my back against the cold wall, and, with a steadiness that surprised me, I formed a plan that did not rely on luck. Luck had no place in justice. Only method did. First, survive. Oxygen was precious, and I could not afford to waste it on bravado. Rhythmic breathing, gentle movement, warming with anything I had on me, these were immediate needs. I adjusted my scarf and rubbed my forearms against my thighs, keeping motion slow and measured. Second, observation. I listened to every word she said, every number she spoke, every contact name. I cataloged them silently, storing them in a ledger in my head. Names like ledger entries, each one potentially prosecutable. Third, leverage. If she wanted to forge documents and move money, she would need witnesses, bank clerks, liars, couriers. If any of those people acted without verifying the circumstances, they would leave trails. My task would be to follow those trails and turn them into a net. Finally, patience. If she thought I would be found dead and forgotten, she had underestimated the stubbornness that had built my life. I would not be hurried, and I would not be fooled by the theatrical moment of discovery she envisioned. I would pull the curtains back in a way that would reveal every hand that had touched her scheme. That night, trapped and numb, I made a promise, not a scream, not a prayer, but a quiet vow. If I walked out of that freezer, I would make sure the world saw the woman who had tried to kill me exactly as she was. I did not want violence. I wanted justice. And justice, I told myself, could be as precise and merciless as the plan that had been plotted against me. The cold bit at my face, but the feeling of purpose warmed me in a different way. It was not the reckless heat of rage. It was the steady warmth of someone who had had enough and had chosen to be clever about it. I closed my eyes, breathed slow, and began to map the next moves in my head, the small, quiet acts that would turn her bravado into her undoing. When finality arrived, when a person decides that survival is secondary to making sure the truth is known, that is when action begins. I felt the line I've crossed become a line I was drawing in the sand. From here on, there was no going back to the woman who had trusted her so blindly. I would become the architect of the end to her plans. And somewhere, beyond the steel and freezer light, she continued to range her life as if the narrative had already bent to her will. She had misread me. She had misread the house. She had misread the fact that, even in that cold, I could still see clearly enough to plan. When she returned, she would not find the woman she expected. She would find someone who had survived and who would make sure. She paid for trying to make me disappear. She would find someone who had survived and who would make sure. She paid for trying to make me disappear. When that thought settled in me, a quiet, stubborn part of my brain began cataloging resources the way a chess player counts possible moves. For years I had lived with a small, private paranoia that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with prudence. After one close call early in my career, an embezzler who almost siphoned funds, because I'd been too trusting. I had quietly set up a handful of safeguards in my life and in my home. I'd called them my housekeeping measures, a phrase I used in jest with my lawyer. But in truth, they were the tools that now felt like a lifeline. The first of those tools was a hidden override I had installed on the walk-in freezer years earlier. Not because I imagined a family member would ever use it against me, but because I refused to be helpless to equipment failure. It was nothing dramatic. A slim metal latch recessed behind a removable trim panel, operable from inside if you knew where to reach. I designed it myself, after reading about cases where people were trapped in industrial units because of an aging lock. At the time, it had felt like excessive caution. Now, thinking of that tiny, unremarkable lever felt like thinking of a key I had buried in plain sight. The second piece of the puzzle was more deliberate and, as it turned out, more valuable than I'd ever assumed it would be. Years ago, anticipating that money brings risk, I had installed discrete cameras around key points in the house: by the front gate, the pantry, the driveway, and yes, the walk-in freezer. They were small, unobtrusive, and wired to an encrypted DVR system in the cellar which, in turn, mirrored everything to a secure cloud account I controlled. I had set it up so that, if anything ever looked off, if someone entered the estate at odd hours or if we had a break-in, I could access the footage remotely and, crucially, so could my lawyer under specific emergency protocols. I never boasted about them because cameras, like locks, work best when people don't know where they are. The irony of those cameras watching me now was almost laughable. As my breath crystallized in the freezer, it occurred to me that the very surveillance I had installed to protect my assets had been quietly doing its job. Elena had not been careful. She had spoken on the phone in the pantry, in a place she assumed would not be watched. She had been confident that being at my house gave her cover. Pride, as I'd observed before, makes people careless. She had given me evidence without intending to. The third advantage I kept tucked away was a set of legal and banking arrangements, layered into my estate documents. It was the kind of detail that reads boring on paper but can unpick the slickest scheme in practice. In my trust, I had insisted that any transfer above a threshold far below 99 million, but meaningful enough, required dual authorization, my signature, and a notarized, verified co-signature. I'd also insisted on a clause that large transfers be run through an escrow account for 36 hours before final settlement, when initiated from outside certain whitelisted devices or locations. My accountant thought it was fussiness. My attorney called it prudence. The bank, I had come to learn through long experience, dislikes litigation and prefers black and white rule following. And bank compliance teams are surprisingly thorough when prompted. Most people who plan thefts for huge sums assume raw force or charm will be enough. Elena assumed signatures could be forged and phone calls could be cryptic, enough to convince a busy clerk. She had not accounted for how boring bureaucracy can become a weapon when you know how to use it. Nor had she counted on the cameras and the override latch and the trust clause, living in the same house as the person she thought she could erase. While I crouched on the freezer floor, I replayed the sounds that had reached me: the hurried banking number, the names she had used, the calm authority in her voice when she told people to process or expedite. Each syllable was a breadcrumb. In my head, I began to map them to the infrastructure I'd built over the years. The bank's compliance hotline I'd used during international transfers, the name of the managing officer who'd handled our accounts last year, the attorney who'd drawn up my trust. I had contacts, people who would believe me because they had already seen my signatures and understood my habits. None of that was random. It had been assembled deliberately over decades. there was also practical hardware within reach. The DVR had a small status LED that blinked through a tiny gap beneath the freezer door. I stayed still until the light registered in my mind, and then I began to hum to keep my breath steady, to keep the blood flowing just enough. The DVR's hard drive lived in the cellar alongside bottles of wine and boxes of archived legal papers. I remembered exactly where the backup drives were kept: a safety deposit box at the bank, a flash drive in a false bottom drawer in my study, a mirrored cloud archive accessible by a secure key only I and my lawyer had. Those redundancies weren't paranoia. They had been my insurance policy. That knowledge crystallized into a plan, in the way small things can compound into a strategy. It wasn't a flourish of revenge. It was arithmetic of consequence. If I could escape the freezer, if I could get to the DVR and pull the footage, I could establish a time-stamped record of her words and actions. If that footage showed her making calls about transfers in my house, that coincided with her locking me away, it would be incontrovertible. The bank would be compelled to freeze accounts pending investigation. My attorney would issue immediate injunctive orders. The police would have probable cause to detain her and to seize devices. What she intended as secrecy would become a paper trail leading straight to her. There was one more piece I had been saving for emergencies, and had only ever whispered about to my lawyer: a quiet alarm protocol tied to my law firm. Years earlier, I had a line of communication set up for times when I needed swift, discreet legal intervention. It was not for everyday disputes. It was a mechanism the bank and my attorney respected because it had been used. When my other company faced hostile actors, it meant that, once triggered, the attorney could call the bank directly, not as a frightened client, but as an authorized legal party asking compliance to lock down transactions pending review. It was a lever of power I had never imagined using against family. All of this, however, would depend on a controlled sequence. I did not want to run screaming to the police right away because hysteria could ruin evidence and give Elena the chance to delete records. I needed to move like someone who had time because, in a way, I did. She had given herself a head start by acting with such confidence. That confidence could be used against her. So the plan I formed while the cold spread a slow numbness through my limbs had steps. That felt like a surgeon's notes. First, get out using the latch, quietly and without dramatic confrontation. Second, access the cellar and retrieve the DVR logs and back them up into a device I carried on me. Third, call my lawyer and present the evidence, asking him to contact the bank's compliance team to freeze transfers and accounts. Fourth, let Elena believe the plan was succeeding enough to draw incriminating confirmation from her move so that the bank and police could see the full sequence of her deception. And finally, bring everything into the light where performance and pretense could no longer hide behind smiles. It struck me then how much of justice is simply refusing to be hurried. My advantage was patience married to preparation. She had rushed because she feared losing the moment. I had been preparing for moments I had not yet faced, and that preparation would, I decided with a cold certainty, be the thing that turned her arrogance into ruin. The freezer was still and white around me. The motor hummed a low, indifferent tune. I tucked those plans under my ribs like a small, hot coal. The next movements would require steadiness, slow breathing, controlled motion. The small confidence of someone who knows the map of a place because she built parts of it herself. I would not act on impulse. I would use what I had laid down over a lifetime: foresight, documentation, and the stubborn conviction that people who betray for money can be made to answer for it. I closed my eyes for a fraction and let the resolve settle. The plan was born not from fury, but from exactness. It felt, perversely, calm. That calm steadied my hands as I reached for the recessed trim panel I had installed years before, and, without haste, eased it away. The small metal latch waited where I had left it, remarkable, almost apologetic in its plainness. I pushed my fingers into the narrow gap and felt the cool metal give under my touch. It slid with a soft, decisive click, and for a moment the world held its breath with me. The door eased open a fraction, letting in a small sliver of the warmer pantry air like a promise. I didn't rush. There was no room for a dramatic exit. Hysteria would be a liability. Composure would be my ally. I pushed the door the rest of the way with a slow, controlled motion, stepped out, and let the breath that had been held for too long flow properly into my lungs. The cold left like a guest who had overstayed its welcome. I checked my reflection in the stainless steel panel by the freezer, hair matted at the temples, cheeks pinpricked with cold, but my eyes steady. I wrapped my scarf tighter around my neck, keeping my movements small. The house still smelled faintly of the lemon cleaner I kept on the pantry shelf, an ordinary scent. That made the moment feel incongruously domestic. I walked down the hallway as if I had merely been delayed by a blown fuse, not as if I had been the target of a calculated attempt on my life. The cellar door was unlocked. I had left it that way on purpose so that, in case of a real emergency, I could move quickly. The security DVR soft green LED blinked in the corner. Like a patient eye watching over sleeping rooms, I crouched, opened the metal cage that concealed the drives, and gently removed the primary hard drive. My hands, though still slightly numb, were steady enough to work methodically. From a small pocket inside my coat I withdrew a thumb drive encrypted, fast, the kind my lawyer kept on hand for situations just like this, and copied a time-stamped clip of the pantry and freezer camera feed. The progress bar crawled across the screen, slow as a heartbeat, and I watched it as if it were a metronome. It felt almost absurdly simple. Press, copy, verify. But that simplicity was what made it powerful. A clear, unedited recording, time stamped, showing Elena pacing the pantry, speaking on her phone. And the exact moment the freezer door closed would be the kind of evidence that left little room for spin. I backed up the clip to two separate encrypted drives and slipped one into my bag, and the other into my coat pocket. Redundancy had always been my rule. I took a moment to collect myself, straightening my sweater and smoothing my hair. Because appearance matters in confrontation, the right composure can steal the thunder of a would-be villain who is counting on shock. Then I walked to my study and locked the door behind me. I dialed my lawyer with fingers that finally felt warm. He answered on the second ring, voice thick with sleep at first, then instantly alert when he heard the tone in my voice. "I have footage," I told him. Not shouting but not minimizing. I explained, calmly and directly, where I had been, what I had seen and heard, and that Elena was in the process of attempting to transfer funds. I told him I had copies already secured and that I needed him to act immediately. I could hear him moving furniture, cracking awake. The sound a reminder that I was not doing this alone. "Do not call the police yet," he said. The kind of strategic command you hope to hear when you are up against an opponent who thinks luck is on her side. "First, I'll call the bank's compliance officer. We need to freeze any transfers, seize any involved devices, and get a preservation order." "Do you want us to detain her?" His question was clinical, not vindictive. That was the right tone. Justice should be clean. "Yes," I said, and the single word felt like a release. "But quietly. Let them make the next move by following the paper trail. Let her make mistakes. Let her prove herself." While he called, I sent the encrypted clip to him through the secure channel we had used in the past for corporate disputes. He confirmed receipt within minutes and then, as promised, called the bank and the compliance people we'd worked with before. He invoked the emergency protocol, used the quiet alarm line I'd set up, and spoke in the language that moves men in suits into action: clear, legal, and immediate. He also called the chief of a local detective unit I'd met through charity work years ago and asked that they quietly stand by to advise the bank's compliance team on the proper chain of custody should an arrest become necessary. Elena, meanwhile, continued to act as if nothing was amiss. That was her fatal mistake. Confidence can feel like armor, but if you think you're armored because no one is watching, you are vulnerable to the cameras you've ignored. She returned to the house later that evening with the air of someone who expected to reap riches. She dialed numbers in my study while standing in the hallway, with her back to the very cameras she believed were blind. Confident, she made specific arrangements: a courier at midnight, a forged courier manifest, a trusted banker who would expedite transfers. She moved as if each step were irreversible because in her mind, they already were. I let her. I did not rush into the hallway to confront her with the ferocity of a woman wronged. Instead, I remained in the study, watching the live feed on my laptop as the scenes unfolded. Her mouth moved. Her hands made gestures that could be read in the recording. She clicked through online banking screens in a desperate, eager way that betrayed her lack of experience with complex transfers. She gave names and times, and in doing so, she created links between herself and the bank employees she thought she controlled. When my lawyer told me the bank had frozen the pending transfers and placed a hold on the accounts, I felt a small, private satisfaction that had nothing to do with triumph and everything to do with rightness. The bank asked for my presence to verify the evidence. I agreed. I dressed as if I were going to a luncheon composed and walked into the compliance office with the collected clips in my bag. Like a quiet weapon, we presented the footage. The compliance officer watched the time-stamped recording, watched Elena's voice coordinate a transfer, and heard her calmly instruct others to proceed. The officer's face shifted from skepticism to concern to action. Within an hour, orders were issued to suspend transactions, seize involved devices, and initiate an internal inquiry. The bank's legal team, uncomfortable at being implicated, moved quickly to preserve records. It was bureaucratic and efficient and exactly what I wanted. Meanwhile, the detective I'd asked to stand by coordinated with local officers. They followed the paper trail: phone records, IP logs, courier schedules, and identified anomalies. Calls that matched Elena's number, logins from devices that traced back to the house, and a courier who had been booked under false pretenses. As the net tightened, Elena's bravado began to fray. She made to frantic calls in which she demanded confirmation from the bank, and grew increasingly agitated when she was told there was a delay. Her voice, in the recordings we had, betrayed her panic. And then came the most satisfying part of all. The moment she realized the bank had frozen the transfers. She called my son, expecting confusion and support. Instead, he was stunned, disoriented, betrayed. The man who had defended her became the man who could not reconcile the woman he loved with the footage he watched. It is always a strange, painful thing to see the person you raised be forced to choose truth over comfort. He chose truth. When the police moved in to detain her quietly, respectfully, without spectacle, I stayed out of the fray. I observed. I let the law, with all its bland seriousness, do what it does best: reduce drama to procedure. Officers read her rights. They took her phone and secured devices. They escorted her out, not in cuffs the way novels depict, but in the careful hands of people doing their jobs. There was no vindictive glee in me as I watched, only a profound relief that systems I had once only half trusted had worked. I returned home that night with the evidence still secured and a sense of exhaustion that was part physical, part emotional. The house smelled the same, clean and ordinary, and that ordinary smell felt like a reclaiming. The cameras would continue to watch, the bank would continue its inquiry, and the law would take its course. I sat in my chair and let the events of the evening settle around me like the last piece of a puzzle, fitting into place. Executing the plan had been less about dramatic confrontation and more about precise, patient steps. It had required me to be calm when my blood wanted to roar, to be methodical where instinct screamed for chaos. In using what I had, my knowledge of the house, the redundancies I'd created, and the quiet people I could call on, I turned a moment intended to silence me into the very thing that exposed her. The most important part was not that she would face consequences, though she would. The law is not blind, but that the truth was no longer hers to shape. She had acted as if she were writing the ending. Instead, she had become a footnote in a legal record that would tell the story exactly as it happened. Justice, I learned that night, is often a matter of preparation and patience, of refusing to be hurried into mistakes by those who think time is on their side. When I finally closed my eyes that night, they were tired in a way that felt earned. I had not only survived, I had used the life I had built to preserve the truth. And that truth would, in time, be the thing that returned to me a sense of safety and closure. When the officers arrived at the estate, they moved with the kind of quiet efficiency that felt almost comforting after the small, jittery chaos of the day. There was no dramatic fanfare, no raised voices from my side, only the measured steps of people trained to do a job without theater. They asked a few pointed questions, took statements, and then, with the bank's compliance team and my lawyer coordinating, they made their move. I stood in the hallway where I could see without being visible, part witness, part guardian, and watched Elena as the situation unfolded. She had been confident not long before, certain that she could shape the facts with forged documents and a polished face. Now she was unspooling in front of more cameras and eyes than she had ever imagined. The expression that crossed her face when the officers said her name was no movie moment. It was a raw, human flicker of surprise that quickly curdled into fear. At first, she tried to smile. It was the nervous smile of someone who has been allowed so much indulgence that the reflex of charm has become a first line of defense. "It's a misunderstanding," she said to the nearest officer, voice practiced in the way of someone who had rehearsed these lines in the mirror. She put on the warmth I had once found disarming, but warmth is a cheap currency when weighed against recorded evidence. They asked her to hand over her phone and devices. Her hands trembled slightly as she fumbled, betraying a brittle composure. Officers moved with gentle firmness. They weren't cruel, but they didn't have to be. They had paperwork, warrants, and subpoenas procured through the bank's immediate legal action, and the kind of impatience born of bureaucratic certainty. They knew how to reduce an arrogant performance to a list of technical violations. I remember the instant her demeanor cracked. It was a small thing, a knock on the door of her courage. Someone from the bank had confirmed receipt of the items she'd tried to rush through. Another agent read back a timeline that perfectly matched the footage my lawyer had provided. Names she'd been using: the courier, the banker, were now subjects of official inquiry. Evidence, once abstract and hopeless, had congealed into a legal document. The look on her face was not theatrical rage. It was a dawning horror that the scaffolding she'd built was collapsing. She protested, and the voice that protested was the same voice that had once calmed my son. But now, the softness had become alarm. She spoke quickly, trying to reframe actions as miscommunications, as mistakes. "We were trying to protect the family," she said, an assertion that sounded hollow even to herself. I felt something like pity in that breathless moment, not pity for her cunning, but for the depth of self-deception it takes to justify harm to another. Then my son arrived. I hadn't expected him so soon. I'd thought his travel plans would delay his coming. But there he was in the doorway, a man caught between two worlds. The son who had defended his wife, and the son who was now shown a version of her he had refused to see. The color drained from his face as he watched footage alongside officers and bank officials. The silence between him and Elena was the kind that screams. He turned to me slowly, eyes searching for a script, for an explanation that would allow him to bridge the impossible gap between wife and reality. I met his gaze the way you meet a mirror when you want someone to see themselves honestly. There was heartbreak there, but also a dawning clarity. He had been misled, yes, but he also had to reckon with a choice. Love's comfortable ignorance, or love's painful truth. "What happened?" he asked, not as an accusation but as a plea. His voice was small. I told him, simply and quietly. I described the freezer, the lock, the calls I heard. I handed him the spare drive that contained the time-stamped footage. He watched, and as each frame played, the puzzle rearranged itself in his head. I could see the old man who had once driven him to soccer practice, the man with files and late nights now giving way to the pragmatic woman he knew in private, the one who made decisions with an eye to consequences. He shifted under the weight of the evidence and then, as if waking from a dream, he turned toward Elena. Her face was a collage of desperation, now an expression that had no charm left in it. She tried to reach for his hand, to plead, but he stepped back, as if the contact might still be contagious, an absurd thought, and yet I understood it. Trust, once compromised in such a deep way, is never easily recovered. "You lied to me," he said finally. There was no performance in it, only an almost childlike hurt. "You told me she had an accident. You told me she was helping. I trusted you." His voice broke on the last word. Elena's response was to beg, bargain, and then to rage, an unstable sequence that showed how unprepared she was for being denied the only audience she'd relied upon. Rage is sometimes a final clench of control. When that fails, the mask slips completely. She accused me of setting a trap, of manipulating people against her. It was a projection of guilt, an attempt to turn attention away from her. Officers wrote down statements. Bank officials explained the freeze and the pending forensic audit. I listened as bureaucracy translated human betrayal into procedural language. It felt procedural and, in a strange way, healing, the language of steps being taken, lines being drawn, consequences beginning to be mapped. The turning point in the confrontation came when evidence beyond the footage emerged. They found messages, text threads between Elena and the courier, forged receipts, even an attempt to forge my signature that matched, in its awkwardness, the horridness of a crime committed under pressure. The paper trail extended into her accounts, transfers scheduled, beneficiaries adjusted, inquiries made under false pretenses. Each discovery was a nail driven into the coffin of her defense. She realized she couldn't spin it. There was no narrative left for her to sell. Defense gave way to incredulity, then to thin, raw pleading. She looked at my son as if seeing him for the first time, and in that gaze there was a confusion that felt almost like remorse, informed, not yet real. I don't know if she felt ashamed so much as exposed. Shame can be a precursor to real change, but in her case it came too late to be redemptive. When they finally led her away, I watched as she looked back, not at me, not even at my son, but at the rooms of the house as if they held something she'd lost. There was a momentary flash of something human, regret, or merely the recognition of consequence, and then the doors closed. The officers were careful. They didn't make a spectacle. The legal system would now take its slow, steady course. After she was taken, my son sat beside me. The grief in him was honest and deep. Not only had he been duped, he had been forced to confront the reality that someone he loved could commit calculated harm. He apologized to me, over and over, for the blindness that had allowed Elena to act. I accepted his apology because I knew that the man before me was not intrinsically cruel. He had been misled and then betrayed. He had to live with the consequences of his choices. So, too, did she. In the days that followed, as investigators completed their work and prosecutors built a case, I watched Elena's world shrink. Her social calls dwindled. Those who had once been charmed by her distanced themselves when faced with the cold facts. Friends who had cheered her ascent found it hard to reconcile the woman who smiled at parties with the woman who tried to steal and silence another human being. Reputation, once inflated by performance, deflated in the face of incontrovertible evidence. Her downfall was not some melodramatic unmasking orchestrated by a vengeful protagonist. It was the consequence of choices she had made. Choices that grew from a root of entitlement and cynicism. She had believed that she could bend rules and people to her will, but she had failed to account for the architecture of precaution I had quietly built into my life. In that failure, she had written her own undoing. That is what true justice often looks like, not a movie climax, but an unromantic, unglamorous series of steps that, taken together, remove power from the unscrupulous and restore it to the violated. Watching her led away, I felt a complicated relief. I had not wanted to humiliate her. I had wanted safety. I had not wanted my son to suffer. I had wanted honesty. The law, clumsy as it sometimes is, had a clarity to it. It reduced her choices to evidence. And evidence is where claims meet consequences. I sat in the house afterward and let the silence settle. It was the same silence that had filled the freezer, but now it felt different. It felt like a room returned to its rightful owner. The cameras remained, the bank remained vigilant, and the trust I had placed in systems, cautious as that trust had been, was, in this case, justified. The confrontation had exposed truths that would be carried into a courtroom, and in time the legal process would determine penalties. When the immediate storm passed, what remained was the slow work of rebuilding the conversations with my son, the revision of my estate to guard against future threats, the quiet settling of a heart that had known betrayal and come through it. Elena's downfall had been complete in the practical sense. She had lost not only her scheme, but the web of influence she once wielded. The moral arc had bent, not by chance, but by consequence. If there is one thing I learned in that hour of confrontation, it is this: consequences are not punishment for the sake of wrath. They are the measured return of action to the actor. She chose to try to erase me. The system, and my own preparation, chose to make certain she could not. The world is full of small measures that, when aligned, can unmask even the most confident of pretenders. The silence in the room after my words sank in was heavy, almost suffocating. I didn't break it. I let my daughter-in-law stew in the bitter realization of what she had done, and what it had cost her. She had gambled her entire future on my silence, and she had lost. I stood slowly, adjusting my coat as though I had just finished a casual visit. Not an ambush of truth and consequence. The police officer, who had remained silent but alert until now, finally spoke. "Ma'am," he said to me, Thank you for your cooperation. We'll handle it from here." My daughter-in-law's face drained of color. For the first time since she married my son, she looked small, like the entitled arrogance she wore like armor had been ripped away. She reached for me, her voice cracking. "Wait, you don't understand. I was desperate. I thought." I turned to her slowly, my voice calm but edged with steel. "You thought you could lock me in a freezer and steal $99 million. You thought my kindness was weakness. And now you finally see the truth. Your greed is the very thing that destroyed you." She collapsed into the nearest chair, trembling. The officers began reading her rights, their words firm and methodical. She barely seemed to hear them. Her eyes locked on me with a mixture of disbelief and terror. I picked up my purse from the table, slipped the will back inside, and straightened my shoulders. "You wanted my fortune," I said softly, "but what you really earned was justice." As I walked to the door, the sound of her crying echoed behind me, raw and broken. That was the moment, the single, perfect payoff. The woman who had nearly taken my life to secure her greed was now facing the consequences. She had worked so hard to avoid her wealth, her reputation, her freedom. Everything she had schemed for was slipping through her fingers like sand. And she knew, beyond any doubt, that it was her own hands that had dug the pit she was now falling into. That was justice. In the weeks that followed, everything unfolded almost exactly as I knew it would. My daughter-in-law was charged with attempted murder, fraud, and conspiracy. The evidence I had provided her attempt to lock me in the freezer, the financial documents she had tampered with, and her arrogant recorded confession was airtight. There was no twisting her way out of this one. The trial was swift. The prosecution painted a clear picture. A greedy woman who saw her elderly mother-in-law as an obstacle to wealth. She had manipulated, schemed, and, finally, crossed the line into violence. The jury didn't hesitate. She was sentenced to a lengthy prison term, and when the verdict was read, she didn't even try to argue. She simply stared blankly, as if her mind had finally caught up with the reality she had been running from. My son was devastated. He had defended her for so long, convinced that her intentions were good, that she was just misunderstood. But betrayal has a way of cutting deeper when it comes from someone you trusted most. He came to me after the sentencing, his eyes red from sleepless nights. "Mom," he whispered, "I don't know how to make this right." I put my hand on his and answered gently, "You can't change what she did, but you can learn from it. Never let blind love make you ignore the truth again." Slowly, we began to rebuild. My relationship with my son was strained for a time, but as the months passed, I saw him begin to heal. He poured his energy into his work, into being a better man, and I was proud of him for it. As for me, I didn't let that dark chapter define me. I updated my will once more, not out of fear, but out of clarity. I ensured my legacy would go to cousins and people who would appreciate it, not exploit it. I invested in community programs, scholarships, and charities that reflected my values. My fortune would not be a curse, it would be a blessing. The freezer, once a symbol of betrayal and near death, was removed from my home entirely. In its place, I had a sunroom built, filled with light and warmth. It became my favorite place to read, to reflect, and to breathe freely. And so, life found its balance again. My daughter-in-law lost everything because of the very greed that drove her. I gained something far more valuable than money: peace, clarity, and a renewed trust in my own resilience. The moral of the story is simple: greed blinds, but justice never does. Those who scheme to harm others often end up destroying themselves. And as for me, I survived. I thrived, and I made sure my story became more than just survival. It became a reminder that even when betrayal locks you in the cold, justice has a way of bringing you back into the light. Don't forget to subscribe and feel free to share your story in the comments. Your voice matters.